So welcome to the second mediums discussion. This is the last event of the semester. Are you guys excited about that? I hope if you can vote that you voted today. Anyway, we'll have so this is the second one of these. I suspect some of you guys came last Thursday. I'm very sorry I missed it. I wish I'd been here, but I'm here tonight, so I'll get to see this one. We have two really special guests tonight, and then Professor Kyle Miller is going to lead a discussion with them. I'm going to read this because I'll forget something, but I know them both very well. One is a graduate of our school, and one I know from a former life in Los Angeles. So the speakers for tonight are Michael Meredith. Michael is an associate professor of architecture at Princeton, and along with his partner Hilary Sample, who is also a graduate of our school. He's the principal of Moss, an internationally recognized architecture practice based in New York City. As I said, or I didn't say, Michael received his B.Arch from Syracuse, which is really excellent, and a master's from Harvard, which is not so excellent. But he's taught there, which is okay. He's taught at Michigan. He was awarded the Muschenheim. Yeah, it is better like that. He's awarded the. What is that called?
Muschenheim.
Muschenheim. I'm not from Michigan, so I don't know. He's awarded the Muschenheim Fellowship. He's written stuff all over the place, including Artforum, blogs, Perspecta. He's a great writer. He's almost as good a writer as I am, but he's not quite as good. He's very good. Moss has been honored with many, many awards, including Smithsonian Design Museum's National Design Award in 2015, a very big deal. A Wholesome Award in 2014, an Academy Award for Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Architectural League's Emerging Voices in 2008. So this guy is a star. Yeah, we're really happy. Give Michael Meredith a round of applause. Mostly because he's from Syracuse. That's the start of everything. Ellie Abrons is a licensed architect and principal of TEAM, which is a terrific office out of Ann Arbor. She's an assistant professor of architecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. She received a BA in Art History and Gender Studies from NYU. She has a master's from UCLA, a great school, where she graduated with distinction and received the AIA Certificate of Merit. She worked in LA with Greg Lynn and then Office Da in Boston. She was later the Alfred Taubman's 2010 Fellow at the University of Michigan. She's received residencies many places, including the McDowell Colony in New Hampshire, and many, many, many other awards. So we're really excited to have them here tonight. Kyle Miller, as you all know, you can give Ellie a round of applause as well. Even though she's not a Syracuse graduate, still, it's good, it's good. Kyle is not a Syracuse graduate either, but he teaches here, and we're really happy about that. So I'm going to really enjoy the discussion. I think it's going to be another exciting one. This is the year of mediums, right?
Yeah, all things
Everything,
medium.
all mediums all the time. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Kyle Miller, and he's going to run the show. Give him a hand.
Thank you, Michael. Always a tough act to follow. I just want to start by saying thank you to all of you for your attendance and participation tonight, but also throughout the semester. It's been really incredible to fill the auditorium each and every time we have a public event. I think it's one of the few experiences that we can kind of share together, and it helps to establish a kind of, let's say, collective discourse that transcends any individual studio and year. And I hope that we can keep that up next semester. Tonight we are joined by two people who I really admire. One I've known for quite some time, and one I just met and had sushi with earlier today. I'm happy both of them accepted my invitation to come to Syracuse to present work and discuss some contemporary issues and topics. Before I turn the microphone over to them, I'd like to briefly introduce the term that serves as the focal point of tonight's event, medium. I should also mention that tonight is the second part of the two-part mini-series on medium. Many of you joined us last Thursday when Jennifer Bonner and Brandon Clifford came and presented new work and humored me when I asked them to also talk about medium. So I'm also thankful that both of you guys came. Super happy to have you here to help us close out the semester. As the saying goes, we saved the best for last. Okay, so the work of emerging architects assists us in the redefinition of the term medium to recurrent conceptual support and towards opportunities to develop new medium specificities. In the introduction, I'd like to briefly rehearse the story that Rosalind Krauss tells us in Under Blue Cup when she documents a similar shift in the fine arts during the middle of the 20th century. I made a pretty good joke here last time about like too much text on my slides, but I already used it, so I have to just keep going. Krauss writes, it was about, so I said I used to get really frustrated when students would put a lot of text on their slides, like because they would be saying it and I'd be finished reading it and they'd still be talking. But then I started to watch Netflix with captions and I found it very pleasurable. And so I started to just put a lot of text up, knowing that all of you have already read this, but I'm going to say it anyways. Krauss writes, but what if it were not a material support? The materials worked by guilds. What if it were the very foundation of representation? What if it were a logic rather than a form of matter? So early in the book, Krauss explores 8 examples of artists inventing mediums to serve as the foundation for aesthetic coherence to develop across many traditional mediums like painting and sculpture and photography. Krauss documents Ed Ruscha's use of the automobile and car culture in general to serve as a recurrent support structure for his creative endeavors. Here we see 26 gasoline stations, one of the first modern artists' books, which documents through photography Ruscha's journey across the American West through Route 66. Krauss quotes Ruscha, "I'm painting on the book covers. I'm just looking for another support. I'm moving away from the canvas, but I can't predict. I still paint on canvas, but there's another shift about to happen somewhere, one that I know I will want to stick with." For Ruscha, the automobile becomes this other support. Likewise, in the book, Krauss references Michael Fried's critique of Clement Greenberg's medium specificity, where flatness is the essence of painting and shape is owned by sculpture. Michael Fried posits that shape can be a medium of abstract painting. And Frank Stella was his example. So here we see Frank Stella manipulating both the content of the painting in conjunction with the shape or figure of the canvas. So much so that someone's inclined to look towards the backside of the painting. So this brings us to possible mediums. This is a book I recently published together with Kelly Baer, Christy Ballier, and Adam Fury. It includes the work of over 40 architects, including Ellie, and has been inspired by countless others, including Michael and Hillary, their work and their writing. Possible Mediums presents a collection of 16 newly invented speculative design mediums for emerging architects. These are the 16. Returning to Krauss, who states, "The invention of medium will strike us as strange, since mediums develop over many centuries during which an entire guild uses their rules as a means of communication. An invented medium would seem to be merely idiomatic. But I will show here that there is no code that is not open to interpretation. A medium is the articulation of such a code." So I want to use one of the 16 mediums in the book to illustrate what Krauss is calling the articulation of a code. And I want to reference lines, which we define as abstract geometric entities manifested as material constructions, organizing form, space, structure, and use. So the code for this type of medium enters into the discussion when architects are precise and conscious about the way that they manipulate aspects of lines, such as thickness, curvature, continuity, and spacing. I'll just go through the 3 that we show in the book as a demonstration of lines as a medium. So I'll start with Empty Pavilion from Kyle Reynolds and McLean Clutter. It's an installation. It's a series of thin, tangled lines that present a loose tracing of 3-dimensional figures in space. Soliciting projective association, the project vaguely recalls roof lines, chimneys, a hallway, and a staircase. So here the lines are quite thin, they're tangled, their spacing is sometimes regular, sometimes irregular. project from Molly and Greg, a continuous closed line constructed as a thick ribbon that doubles as a place to sit or lie down. When the line lifts up off the ground, it forms arched gateways to the inside of the ring. So again here, a circle, thickened, pulled upwards to perform spatially. And then lastly, a project from Bittertang, Mikey Lovrich and Antonio Torres. Buru tightly stacks bundles, knots, and weaves together to thick lines to produce a continuous surface that acts as both a cave, a space for performers, and a mound, furniture for spectators. So Kraus writes, the artist who discovers the conventions of a new support can be said to be inventing a medium. I believe we have two architects with us here tonight that are doing just that. We've already welcomed them, but let's welcome them again. So Michael's going to present first, followed by Ellie, and then I'll join them for a conversation. And like we did last time, we're happy to take questions. So thank you.
Okay, so what I was going to do, I took this as an opportunity, thank you Kyle and Michael for the embarrassing introduction, to sort of think about medium. Like I taught a studio at the GSC in 2009 on medium, on medium specificity in a way, and it's a chance to be sort of self-indulgent. And at that time, I'm now tenured, so I'm not as ambitious as I once was maybe, but like I would do movies of all the studios before the final review, kind of recapping. And so this is something left from that. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I'll scrub through it. But I think at the beginning,
I hate when people sit close to me too. All you need to know about Clement Greenberg is it's the sentence about characteristic methods. Each practice is defined by its characteristic methods. And that makes it medium specific, and then the problems are produced by those characteristic methods. I don't believe in medium specificity. I do believe in disciplinary specificity. Yeah. Can you go faster? All right. So representation. Yeah, representation defines the medium specificity of architectural project, and it's not. And we decide it's not construction. If you are saying you want to keep disciplinary specificity with the loss of medium specificity, how do you keep disciplinary specificity? Discipline. What you said was you started over and use trial and error to produce an effect. And if you do that, you are fucked. Every field, what we mean by modernity, is the triumph.
Anyways, it goes on and on and on, and there's a whole bunch of here's Jason Payne. There was a search at the time for what is medium, in the same question. I think the thing I would say is that I'm kind of struck by maybe the small differences between possible mediums and what I was thinking at the time, and it was interested in post-medium specificity, and so for better or for worse, I think I was stuck on more of the idea of technical support for architecture as medium in a Greenbergian way, and not to say that it's neither material nor totally, let's say, conceptual, but it somehow can work as both. To some degree, the technical support it's like how you work through something. I do think that in architecture, this is what my notes here. In architecture, medium has thought through representation, geometry, composition, through construction, through physical material, through abstract ideas like space. The basic mediums for me would be the form, space, geometry, material, program, or use of function, structure, perhaps something like energy could be argued, although it's kind of tough for me. Archetypes may be the image as well. And it keeps sprawling and branching from there, perhaps. My one critique, perhaps, for a point of discussion would be something like in the list of things you have, it's like I'm not sure about like something like furniture or even automobile to some degree. Krauss, which seems less like a technical support and more like a subject that is supported by it. So the one thing I would also say about after I taught this studio, I remember I taught the studio and it was kind of an experiment in a way, and one of the, I will say, senior faculty at the time pulled me to the side after the review and just said, well, that was a real failure. You should just go back to what you were teaching before, and gave me like a warning and just like, listen, you should do that, try that again. The one thing I would say is that for me, one of the problems potentially of thinking about the medium over and over again is the problem of conceptual art practice today. So like for me, let's say post Duchamp, all questions are like conceptual architecture and conceptual art turn into big questions. Like we are constantly just concerned with like, is this architecture? Like is it art? Is it architecture? That is somewhat the role of, let's say, conceptual art. To question it, and we've lost kind of a certain specificity because of it. So for me, the problem, let's say, of a line is a line a medium, but how is it a medium? Perhaps is more important. Okay, that's just to already throw out like kind of where the points for conversation later, and I'll just show some stuff. I just put together a few things, relatively recent stuff, also thinking about the problem of, let's say, the body of work thing that we were talking about at one point. But so I'm going to show just a couple of recent books: a housing project, a house, a note with some of the snippets of a video or stills, an object, a house, a video, an exhibition. First thing is a book we just finished up at MIT. Scale Figures of Architecture. It's out, you can buy it, I think. Basically what we did is, it was a kind of, it was for an exhibition put together by Mark and Beatrice at this little Biennale on the human. A few years ago now, we focused on scale figures, and we had a team of students in the summertime just basically, I would say it was pretty unedited even, like just to go out and find scale figures and drawings by architects and just collect them. So this is from an Albert Alto drawing. I usually make a joke here about how Albert Alto invented Darth Vader. But like but you can start to just see how architects depict people. This is a recent project. We do books for a lot of our projects. This is for a housing project in Mexico and Japan. And it's a master plan with 32 architects, Mexican architects and American architects. We did the master plan in the Welcome Center, and we put together a book talking about it, representing it, having architects sort of describe, let's say, the vernacular types or typology in their work. And there's an essay by Giovanni Barassi on the idea of urbanism as a garden. This is it as it's being built right now. This is a house in upstate New York. I'm just presenting us kind of series of things that kind of quickly here. It's not a deep explanation. Maybe it's just a single family house, upstate New York. A series of, it's called the House with Courtyard, kind of series of, let's say, pavilions collected together with a void cut through it at the center, which is a garden yet to be planted. But this is built. There's something nice about the kind of effects of it that are kind of unexpected in a certain sense, but the kind of splitting of one thing being split into two, where it reads as both one and two, and then the series of these pieces collected, and things like you get a kind of Venturi-esque moment through the courtyard cut. Series of rocks that have started as models and became real. Details. It's actually done. These are all photos. A video from we did after the Chicago Biennial, the first one, corridor house called A Different Courier. Sort of a story about how things just moving inside and outside of people and objects. Reproductions, this is an old project from 2014 now, when at one point we were really into accessories too, like Michael here. And trying to think about, we just got caught, we've always do like these projects I would say are no client and just for us to think about architecture. So, you know, the videos are one thing, software is another thing, and then we were to let's say we wanted to sell everything all the time. And part of it came up, and we did for a little while, and it was exhausting, and then we stopped. And then I would say it's even my own, let's say, education here. In a way, this is a way for us to deal with narratives of architecture as taught to us. So one of the things I was always taught is there were two types of architects. So you were either Loos or Hoffman. You were either a serious conceptual architect or a kind of cultural, player in a way. You're kind of crass, selling, caught up in commerce and class and everything like this. So we wanted to confuse it a little bit, so we made up stories about that Loos was doing, it did a career discovery program or something with Hoffman, and Hoffman assigned a scented candle, and this is what Loos came up with. And we wanted to pick things that were decor, like what the worst thing you could ever think of for architects. I mean, I think it's like what people would think is the worst thing, a scented candle, perhaps, or the most frivolous thing. And yet, I'm sure we all love scented candles. The stories about architecture. So this is a story about, and also a thing, a Venturi, op table, etc. Awesome. A chance to sort of produce this thing. This is like Lily Reichner's, making up the Bauhaus avant-garde soap program and telling stories about it. So, anyways, I'm just going to click through it. This is another recent house from this past summer, a proposal that was rejected for a very small house, basically 350 square feet or something, and most of it's outdoor space underneath this big roof that's there. You might say, an older project, Element House. I'm not going to go into specifics because I don't think that's the point of this. Another video that came out of that at the same time. We've always made half-inch equals a foot models, I think from the very beginning, that are very detailed, that we photograph or video. I'm always worried that would happen. This is kind of the models, and this is a kind of recent exhibition that's closing in a few days that I did at Princeton called Low Resolution Houses. Basically, 44 low resolution, 44 team is in it. Houses, kind of around the idea of low resolution, which we can talk about. I try to use three categories of low resolution. Let's say low resolution elements of roofs or chimneys, etc. Low resolution tectonics, things that seem unmade or heavy on the joints or different materiality. And then low resolution in terms of organization, almost non-compositional, square, circle, very dumb, let's say plan making, or just a mess in a way, something that's not sophisticated compositionally. Let's say. And then I asked all the architects also to provide a material sample from the house. That's it. I don't know how to...
What else is please?
It's over here.
I just want to so I'm recovering from a cold, so hopefully excuse my voice, and I have cough drops, which I may need to use. Thanks for the invitation to come, Kyle and Michael. I'm happy to be here. So I think Kyle's prompt to think about mediums and the work of team was an interesting one for me. I think it caused me to think really specifically about the characteristics that kind of arise directly from the techniques of design and representation that we engage in the kind of structures of support for our ideas. So, and I think primarily I came away thinking that if we were to have to kind of identify maybe the medium through which we work, it would be something about image and material, or maybe more specifically this idea of image of material and image as material. So I think broadly speaking, we try to expand definitions of architectural medium and materiality to include images, and see that as a necessary part of architectural work today. So originally this idea of, or kind of like when we started thinking about the relationship between image and material, it really arose out of the necessities of representation. So we were working on this project, the Detroit Reassembly Plant, which was a project for the Architectural Imagination, which was an exhibition at the US Pavilion in 2016. And the project, if you're not familiar with it, it responded to a call from the curators to think about an architectural proposal, or actually a building proposal specifically, for the former Packard automotive plant in Detroit. And so we approached the site pretty matter-of-factly, taking stock of what was there, and kind of viewing the vast pile of materials as a resource. And the reason that we did that was we realized that the dominant cultural narrative surrounding these abandoned buildings in Detroit was communicated primarily through the materiality of the physical structure. So there's a kind of familiar narrative that is probably known to you of decline, right? And that's communicated through the kind of overgrowth of vegetation, the patina and the grime of materials, the crumbling structure, etc. But that materiality, of course, is inherently mediated, right, through photographic and digital imagery and what's commonly known as ruin porn. So I think in order to evoke alternative narratives and steer those associations with urban decline towards something more constructive, we thought we needed to work on the image of that material. And that for the 2D representations of the project, then it wouldn't really make sense for us to kind of draw them, put that in air quotes, in the conventional sense, right? To abstract the kind of materiality that we were interested in into something like line work, or to simulate it with texture maps or rendering software. The approximations wouldn't adequately communicate the aim of the project, which was to kind of re-image these materials in a prototypical proposal for building. So instead we developed a set of techniques that blend physical and digital material and work with material prototypes that we made from the same building debris found at the Packard plant. So this is an example of one of the images from the project. And this particular image is made as a composite of several different inputs. So it includes photographs of material studies, renderings that use texture maps and bump maps generated by those photographs, and then renderings of photogrammetry scans of material prototypes. So the process takes physical materials as a starting point and then layers multiple digital translations of those materials along with digitally modeled form to produce an end result that can't really be parsed in terms of its inputs. So the mixing and layering of materials and their copies then collapse the digital and the physical into one expanded form of materiality that includes characteristics of both. And we were interested in working kind of through the same media culture that makes ruin porn and images of decaying buildings so popular and prominent. Right? This project of redirecting the narratives of urban decline to those of abundance is ultimately a project of image making. And so this approach to representation extended from the 2D images, which you were just looking at, to the model. So these are images of the physical model. And rather than produce a kind of tabletop object to be viewed maybe from a distance, we thought about the physical model as a device that basically produces images of itself. So this interest that we have in the relationship between material and image has led us to sometimes use photogrammetry, as we did in the images for this project. So most of you are probably familiar with photogrammetry, but essentially, here's a diagram of how you would do a photogrammetry model of a rock, right? You would take a bunch of photographs of that rock from many different angles. You would provide those images to a photogrammetry software. It would essentially spit out for you on the other end, like a high-resolution digital model of a rock that's nearly photorealistic. And in doing that, it produces these two sets of information, right? The texture map on the top, which is a kind of image of the rock, now fragmented, and a three-dimensional high-resolution mesh model. So, for instance, here would be a closer view of the texture map of a rock, and you can see like the styrofoam that the rock was sitting on and the T-pin that was used to keep the rock from tipping over when it was originally photographed. So you could take these image fragments, which are called, well, they're called many things, I suppose, depending on who you ask, but kind of UV, we think of them as like UV images, so UV being the axes that are oriented to the object, right, different than XY, which is the axes oriented to the, kind of more globally, let's say. You could stitch these UV images back together to produce the photorealistic rendering of the rock. But you also could, if you take them on their own, kind of recompose them into new images or new rocks that are maybe rock-like but have different logics. And I think one of the things that was interesting for us, I mean, these are just kind of quick studies, but one of the things that we were interested in is that the edges of these UV images don't bear a relationship to the form or the edges of the actual rock, but they're determined by the logics of the digital process. So this kind of utilizing or making visible the digital process is something that continues to interest us. So in this project, another rock, we basically took a rendered image of a rock and used it to produce this new three-dimensional physical rock. So we went physical rock to digital rock, back out to physical rock here. And so this is produced through a series of image planes. The rendered image of the rock gets sliced into rows and then stretched or kind of smeared. And so here we're treating image as material through this 3D translation and this literal kind of thickening of the image through the pulling apart of these layers and the stretching to such a degree that at the top you get what was the representational image of the rock becoming just abstract bands of color. These are some of the layers, actually. So these would be the images which would be printed and then assembled to produce that overall object. This project, which is called Arrange Life, was a proposal for a house in the Hollywood Hills in Los Angeles. It was a losing competition entry. And you know, we're still, of course, here continuing to think about kind of the materiality of images, or image as material. And so the image of the mountains, their rockiness, their rugged surface, get used in the project in multiple ways. Maybe first as image printed on these perimeter walls, which contain the site on the south and the east edges, but they really echo the kind of flat graphic quality of the Hollywood sign up above there, which you can see in the mountains. And they kind of create a visual play between the scenographic mountain range and the physical mountain range. A top view of the house where you can see the accumulation of objects and there's a kind of loose relationship between inside and out that's inspired by LA's long history of experimentation in single-family houses. Starting in the mid-century. So, and as I mentioned, we're working with rock textures, or rockiness as a quality and as an image. And it gets taken up in two-dimensional profile and three-dimensional shape and surface texture and color. So this is that same top view now, but kind of in full color with the textures in the images, and you can see that rocks appear as these thick, slumping, kind of overlapping surfaces that pile up to produce the roof covering. rocks also appear as just silhouettes that define edges of surfaces. They show up as pixelated images and as material finishes. This is the house in plan. So you can see that perimeter wall now on the south edge and the eastern edge. And the house the space of the house occupies this valley that we were kind of trying to produce between the perimeter wall and the mountain range. And then we were trying to, so we were using lightweight metal framing and these geometric primitives. You can see the kind of cylinder kitchen at the top there, to loosely interact and differentiate spaces within the house. So they were thought of as these zones which would collect tools and belongings, and elements get pulled apart. So walls and structure, interior, exterior, so that they can be combined with imagery and composed in a scene. And we like to think of that exposure of studs or other elements of construction or assembly as potential for those elements to be experienced in an unusual way. So the structure and support of the house, the kind of artifice of the wall gets exposed to produce a scenography, an immersive experience where the spatial and the visual merge. Here are sections. Elevation. So I think similar to Detroit Reassembly Plant, these images depict building proposals, but they also are a means for us to explore this, how digital and physical traits can kind of merge in these hybrid representational formats. So in this drawing, we're interested in the kind of profile of the house resonating with the surrounding mountains, but also the printed imagery on the house resonating with the textures of the physical ground, and then images of the physical ground blending with digital representations of the ground. So there's this constant kind of churning and kind of almost contamination that's happening, or translation that's happening across digital and physical mediums. So this is a recent project called Additional Address, where we are still kind of thinking about this spatializing of images and this interplay of 2D surfaces and 3D forms. This was part of a show at Yale called Adjacencies. There's the model in the gallery. It was curated by Nate Hume. And so I don't know if you're familiar with ADU as a term, but that's what this is. It's an accessory dwelling unit. You may know it as an in-law unit or a granny flat. It's essentially a secondary living unit. It can be attached or detached, but it exists on a lot with a single family house. And as an urban strategy, they're popular in places that are struggling with affordable housing. So you've probably read about them being popular in places like Portland, Oregon, or Vancouver, who are kind of pioneers in the ADU movement. But and they're appealing because they basically double the density, right, on a domestic lot or a residential lot. I think affordability is an explicit mandate of ADUs, so cheap construction becomes a priority. And so for us, this meant kind of designing the house with straightforward construction logics, and then figuring out cheap and effective ways to use image and scenography to expand the tiny space of the home. And one of the primary ways that we do this is by kind of expressing the assemblies of materials as layers and stacks, and then utilizing image to produce artificial horizons within the interior. So these are drawings of the house, imaginary scenario or scenes, let's say, of the house kind of under construction that reveal its assemblies, some of which will get hidden and some of which will remain exposed. I was going to say it's tiny, but it's 800 square feet, so that makes it seem really big compared to your 350 square foot project, which I think qualifies as a tiny home, according to HGTV. But it's 800 square feet, which is the maximum size that it can be code. And so we tried to compress that, we tried to counter that compressed footprint through this use of image and scenography, and kind of printing imagery directly on the low-cost materials that make up the floors, the walls, the furniture, and the ceiling. So it's a SIPS house, a structural insulated panel, where we were working with a SIPS manufacturer to just print directly on the OSB. So we're kind of trying to avoid extra finishes, stuff like that. So the two-dimensional images layer between three-dimensional objects and vegetation, and we have this kind of idea about blending domestic life with the existing site through these horizons that move from the inside to the outside. And then the last project I just want to touch on quickly is this one called Living Picture, which is the project where we've most explicitly, I think, thought about image as material. So this is a temporary outdoor theater built on the grounds of the Ragdale Foundation north of Chicago. And they hold a competition where they invite architects to reinterpret a former Ragdale theater. So maybe you're familiar with Molly and Greg's project that they did the year before this. Called a ring. Yes. Rounds. Sorry. I know that in my head. Sorry. So this was the year following that, and it's basically, it's a temporary outdoor theater, and the original one was designed by an architect named Howard Van Doren Shaw. So we were really interested in his original design, which you can see a plan in a section here in a photograph. But one of the things we were interested in was the way in which the original theater was kind of integrated with the landscape. So there were these planted arborvitae hedges and kind of existing trees and brush, which form the proscenium and the wings of the stage. He had just these three arches and two columns, which complemented that. And then you can see this low limestone wall, which produced a circle within which the audience would sit. And we were reminded of this, something like this, the tableau vivant, where live actors would recreate a scene, usually something historic, or sometimes I guess they would be famous paintings as well. And we wondered if, kind of like this, we could like reproduce the original ring, but instead of using living actors, we would use digital imagery. And so we created this digital simulation of the original Ragdale ring, the one that Howard Van Doren Shaw designed. We rendered it. We took perspective renderings from kind of three main axes as you enter the site, and then we then projected those renderings onto a series of kind of digital primitives that also provided seating and shade and a stage for the theater. And so the idea is that you would produce this kind of fragmented image, or many fragments of many images, let's say, of the historical ring, kind of always incomplete, but discernible in some ways as you would move around the site, and that would produce an active engagement as people would move through and occupy this image. And maybe in terms of, I'm just going to scroll here. So they're built like awnings. So they have a lightweight steel frame. It's wrapped in printed vinyl. It basically uses the construction technique that is used in any outdoor signage. So that made them very lightweight, durable for the outdoors, and pretty cheap. And also meant that because we were printing them on vinyl and wrapping, that was kind of the logic behind using the digital primitives, right? We needed to have developable surfaces that we could unroll flat. But in terms of thinking about image as material, the project became interesting for us, kind of like in terms of the actual way in which we had to deal with the imagery. So this is the texture map that came out of the software we used to produce the competition entry. It's called Blender. And each one of these images corresponds to one of the physical objects on the site. And so these would wrap cylinders or cones or cubes. And here you can see on the left one of these images, and the resolution is really low. And so I think because we were interested in image as material, we took kind of literally, let's say, the constituent qualities of image, things like resolution, hue, saturation, contrast, as material qualities. And in terms of resolution, now that we're building this thing at full scale, we had to think about what would register at the scale of human experience. So this image on the left wraps a cylinder. So when that cylinder is 10 feet tall, what kind of resolution do you need in order to be able to understand the kind of content of the imagery and to produce the overall kind of site experience that we wanted to? So what we ended up doing was basically rendering out those elements as individual high-res elements and then recompiling them. And this allowed us to kind of play a game with between flatness and perspectival recession in the compilation of these images. You can see here, that's the final print file, and then here's that column on the site. Here's another one with a cone. And you see us like translating not only the elements like the wall and the plants, but also the glitches and the kind of digital idiosyncrasies that arose from the process, which was important to us, along with this green grid. So I'm sure that for all of you, this green grid is familiar as the transparency grid in Photoshop, although not green. And so for us, that's part of the digital nature of the image. It's part of its materiality. It reveals the environment of digital production in which these images were produced. And in the project then, the grid no longer indicates transparency as it would in Photoshop, but now becomes an integral part of the image. And we're interested in the way that the grid, as a characteristic that signifies digitalness, could be like realigned or reassociated. So in this project, we're using the grid as part of the imagery in physical space to try to integrate human and digital experience. And then the last kind of type of imagery in the project are these things we call stickers or Easter eggs. They're little kind of signs of life that were sprinkled throughout the project, kind of waiting to be discovered. So you can see like coolers, coffee cups, cheap plastic chairs. And these are different than the overall imagery in that they are oriented to the site. So they sit on the ground or they sit on the tops of benches, as opposed to being oriented to the overall perspective of the scene, the kind of large-scale scenography. So here you see this kind of Art Trotter style plastic chair. And then you can see that chair wrapping a cube here on the lower right. So maybe to wrap up, I would just say that I think we're not only interested in the physical immediacy of materials, but also in kind of materials mediation, which we see as an inevitable part of our digital world. This is an image of a retail display from a store called Menards, which is a big box hardware store, a regional one in the Midwest. I don't think you have Menards here, do you? No. But about 95% of our aesthetic inspiration comes from this store. And briefly, I mean, this is a corrugated steel egress window well that's been printed with an image of a stone wall. And it's shown here in a retail display with both real materials, right? Dimensional lumber and insulation foam, but also images of CMU block printed, not to mention the actual printed window well you could buy. So I think you probably can understand why Team loves this retail display and this window well in particular. But I think, we understand architecture today to be received primarily through images. I think it's something that it's important for architecture to work on this. We're interested in the idea that living a digital life means that the majority of our experience and our information is gleaned through mediated formats. And I think accompanying that kind of image saturation is an instability between image and meaning. And that instability is an opportunity for us to kind of, I think, work on imaging materials or imaging assemblies or imaging architecture. That's it. Thanks.
No.
You want me to pull up your slides?
Yeah, can you do that? And we also take this. Oh boy. When's doing that stuff?
Hold on.
Updates?
Is your volume up all the way?
Try it again.
There we go. Okay, I'm actually still trying to figure out if the introduction that you said was embarrassing was Michael's or mine. I'm hoping it was Michael's. Yeah. It would be bad if mine.
He played that.
Mine was embarrassing. That would be a bad way to start. That's what I'm paid to do.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you both. I do want to revisit some of the things you said at the beginning, Michael. Let's say in relation to subject matter versus medium, which I think is an interesting question. For us, we were trying to kind of stick to the definition of medium as a material that could be worked. So like the line for us was a digital material that could be worked, and rocks are materials that can be worked. The automobile then is a question, like that maybe it's not, it's actually just the subject matter that sits underneath and unifies everything. I wanted to begin with that to help segue into the first topic of conversation. So we'll just go through two topics. maybe it lasts 15 minutes, and then we're happy to open it up for questions. And I'm going to use texts that both Michael and Ellie have written relatively recently, and try to do my best to paraphrase, and they're more than welcome to correct me. So I want to first start with Michael's text towards a body of work which was published in Log 35, where he's making a case for continuity and coherence across projects as a way to establish a body of work for a practice. It enables the office to maintain a discernible identity, perhaps in relation to what they may offer to the discipline and to the built environment. He calls it an ethos of production and the construction and curation of relationships between various buildings and other formats. I think that implies working across multiple traditional mediums and in a way that helps to kind of unify the body of work that gets put out into the world. So I might suggest that how we're defining medium is one way in which an office can establish such coherence, that a medium is established, defined, and developed across multiple projects. I think it's also a kind of it's a way in which actually I think a generation can also kind of establish coherence by sharing conceptual support structures. And then in an essay of Ellie's that we'll also revisit in a moment, I think she talks about kind of consistent disposition to design. And for them it's through the method that she's shown us here tonight, of photogrammetry as a kind of technical support, and then the translation and exchange between the digital and physical. So the question that I'd like to ask is, can a limited set of recurring conceptual supports, mediums, be the thing that unifies a body of work? I guess I'll also propose alternatives such as subject matter, to bring that back onto the table, or even kind of style of representation, or a technique such as photogrammetry. So how are each of your offices kind of consciously building a body of work? This also assumes that doing such a thing is productive, which I think it is.
Maybe a little context for the body of work, because like what that came out of for me to some degree is like in a way it's very specific to how I was seeing the world. Well, I don't remember when it was written, but it was a couple of years ago. It was maybe, and I think the obsession was like really, a lot of the things I write, I think really come from the point of view of a teacher, more than a practitioner. So somehow there was a loss of, was noticing a kind of loss of, and even an interest in the body of work, and in a sense that, you know, the obsession with, let's say, art daily, or even the way that we receive media, receives and projects architecture, it just seems like the speed at which everybody gobbles up trends and puts them out and moves on to the next thing, et cetera, I found kind of troubling. And I was also trying to think of terms, thinking consciously of, like, let's say, Stan Allen's project versus practice, and other terms that have been used in the field to define something, like a point of view or position, let's say. To me, I kind of retreated. In a way, I don't know if it's sort of an old-fashioned thing. I don't know, to go to the body of work, but a way that you can. I found that I'm interested in architects who construct bodies of work, and for me, that's a kind of opposite of almost a corporate mentality, where you just follow the market logics. But there's something else. That there's a kind of autonomy. Semi-autonomy that's produced through your own work. That, like, for us, we can't do whatever we do, we're already thinking of what we've done and trying to understand the relationships that we're building between things, between it. So it doesn't incorporate multiple mediums, media formats, etc. I think you can do, like all architects that admire, perhaps, think about representation and furniture and buildings, etc., and cities, and start to think about the relationships between these things. So that was the kind of explicitly where, at that point, it was coming from.
Do you distinguish between body of work and project, capital P project?
Yeah, I think the project's more specific in a sense that it comes out of maybe a stated, like the project versus the practice thing. I mean, the point of that essay was just somehow confuse the two as terms, I guess, in a way. But like the project as a kind of, if you talk to someone like Eisenman or something, like the idea that you need to have explicit thesis first, I mean, in a way, academia wants to produce this too, is you have a very clear stated position first, and then your work somehow represents that. I suppose I was trying to find some way out of that also.
That makes sense. The body of work is more bottom up, or it's an accumulation. It's an accumulation over time.
It's a set of
The project is
relations,
more
let's say. It's a set
top down.
It's a set of relations between, it's a kind of relational structure between things that produce something greater than itself, hopefully.
Yeah.
So, that's it.
And I think, I guess it seems like the relationship between body of work and medium would be very loose, right? Like, and I think even like the way I interpret the possible medium's position, the relationship to medium, is that those are 16, but you could shuffle people across categories very easily.
And it happens, yeah.
So there's a kind of acceptance of that, or maybe even an encouragement of that kind of contamination. And I think, yeah, so like the body of work can be produced across multiple mediums, or even.
I think the intent is somehow maybe even the possible mediums is similar to, the body of work is maybe more individual to, let's say, practices or something.
Yeah.
But the idea of the mediums, there is a real search right now to, I think we've gone through a phase almost of, there's a search for new specificities, let's say, in the field, and new narratives. And medium, for sure, is one way to do that. That we can kind of construct other narratives that allow us to compare and discuss architecture. So, I mean, the thing is, for me, is like how to find more specificity in it. That was my provocation at the beginning, because I am concerned always when we leave all questions as general questions. And this was my the post-Duchamp thing. It's like, it's like how many times can we keep saying, oh, is this architecture, and is that an interesting question over and over again? At some point we have to try to get into more specificity. So, again, thinking about it as somebody who's teaching, I just see there is a kind of loss. There has been a kind of radical, in my education, in my time teaching as well, like radical shift in the field where and then I saw some of the slides about indifference. I mean, it's like there was a kind of incredible expansion of technical knowledge that we all undertook. Like we can code, I think it's actually, I think, sadly disappearing again. But we can code, we can do advanced modeling, we can render, we can work with data, simulate. It's like the things we can do now are way beyond what was possible when I was a student here. And so there was this crazy expansion, but there was a kind of, at some point, the narrative of architecture really went from the technique to the technical, like the 90s stuff of technique-based to a technical discourse. And then the technical discourse, really, like all technology, was really about a kind of very progressive, Hegelian model of the world, almost of like a kind of a very progressive idea of architecture and society, that we are kind of working towards something better. And I just think at some point, or idealized, it broke down. People stopped believing in it, and there was a kind of real desire for non-ideology, almost, or kind of cooling down in the media period, the indifference thing, or something that was kind of heating up from technology, and then it was desire that almost, all of a sudden, I would see students present stuff with hand drawings or something. I mean, that would have gotten out of here if that was like hand drawings. Like it was just like anything goes almost, but at some point, because there was an exhaustion of the technical discourse, and nobody really believed it anymore. It didn't really feel like it was progressive. We didn't really feel like, how many more noise can we see, and pretend like they're interesting. So.
Yeah, I think I asked the question because I think I see in both of your practices a very legible body of work, and I think I have just a couple of things. Like, I think it's established across or let's say in many ways and across multiple levels. So I think both of you rely on a kind of consistent representational style, if I may, to kind of unify what otherwise might be variable and diverse. And so I think like material strategy might be diverse from project to project, but what brings some of that stuff back together, in both of your practices, what brings it back together is representational style. I think in your case, Michael, you and Hillary, I think, let's say, move a kind of a sensibility about formal organization across lots of projects, like there's misalignments, cracks, clusters. It's not the kind of strict order that we see from, let's say, pre-digital stuff, or the kind of seamlessness that we see with the digital project. And then I think with teams work, just the kind of the technique and the photogrammetry and the commitment to this kind of negation of difference between virtual and real, or fake and real, or authentic and synthetic, I think is something that I see that's worked through multiple projects and helps to kind of unify them as a kind of true body of work. And so it's something that I've quite admired, and I think students are also able to pick up on that. They don't just like a project, they like the office, which I think is something that you were claiming is something to shoot for. Like we don't, not to kind of turn our attention away from singular buildings or kind of singular architecture, kind of collaborative efforts that tap many of these things that we use to convey our interests. The next thing that I wanted to make my way through was, let's say, two, I don't know that, I think we can't call them competing positions, because I think there's positions that have overlaps and at times diverge. And these two, again, are coming from pieces that Michael and Ellie wrote in log, Michael on the term indifference in log 39, and Ellie's piece on camp in log 41. The piece was titled For Real, which I also just learned was Chipotle's new slogan. But I like, you don't like Chipotle? I like it. For real, like real food.
Right, I get it.
So, again, I'll like kind of, with great anxiety, try to rehearse some of the things that they said in those pieces, and then let them correct me.
Yeah.
So in Michael's case, in kind of proposing this position of indifference, I think he's making a case first that there's kind of two competing positions. One that is about architecture expressing problem solving, and the other of which kind of positions architecture as a kind of representation of itself as opposed to realism. And he draws a parallel to art movements in the 60s that also kind of pursue aesthetic indifference. Indifference to Michael is representational, it's removed, cerebral, ambiguous, banal, unoriginal, obscure, commonplace. I think some of these terms have negative connotations, but I know in fact that it's meant to be complementary. Architects operating in this model are indifferent to narratives of progress through technology and data. Its position is underscored by calculated ambiguity. Ellie's piece, again, For Real, draws analogies to Susan Sontag's notion of camp, while proposing a new framework for post-digital materiality, something that she's written on previously. Camp is deliberately exaggerated and theatrical, it's humorous, and it's real. Ellie is also suggesting an overall disposition and approach, something I referenced earlier, when she writes, or that is as she writes, Camp proposes an antidote to two problematic contemporary mindsets, the moralism of binary thinking and the cynicism of post-internet culture. So I think, again, she's not kind of introducing a position that kind of is meant to overtake those two, but kind of simply an alternative viewpoint that's, I think, much more optimistic and inclusive. Camp materiality is artificial, mannerist, humorous, and pluralist. It's pleasurable and discursive. It's theatrical and sincere. It's engaged and critical. Camp sponsors playfulness and, to quote Ellie, suggests ways to move away from boredom and disillusionment to a new mindset, something more sincere. So I think that's maybe a point of contention, like the level of sincerity that we might associate with indifference, versus another term which I think has been associated with that project, which is one of irony, which I think you might reject, perhaps. Hold on.
I don't reject that.
So I'll let you correct me, but again, I think I'd like you guys to kind of talk through some of the similarities and differences of these two positions. Perhaps you can elaborate on my generalizations as well.
You want to start?
Well, I mean, I actually think you characterized them pretty well.
I mean, I also was just quoting you. So,
Yeah.
I would, yeah.
I don't really take issue with the characterization.
I could.
Who would take issue with it?
please do.
Well, I guess it's hard because I think the way that you've laid them out in the slide, it's so kind of fixed that they seem really,
Go back. Is that better?
no. But I mean, they seem like there could not be possible overlap between them. But I think
Warhol.
there is.
Yeah, Warhol.
Mhm.
I mean, like,
Drop
no, I mean, there's, for sure, there's
Yeah.
overlap. There's tons of overlap. The thing I would say also, would want to just give context for some of these things where they come out of, and in some way, I haven't read it, but also for real, I mean, I don't like the Chipotle thing, but there's kind of like a whatever kind of quality to it too, like for real. You know, I like the for real title, but like in a way, I didn't really read it, but I assume in a strange way, it is a kind of reaction to the indifference thing. Now hearing it like this, because you're lumped into indifference, and I think a lot of people got upset by being lumped in there. But for me, I mean, literally, when I was approached by Cynthia to write for this was right after Trump was elected, and it was supposed to be a piece on Trump or something, somehow related to Trump. So I had a whole thing I worked on through, there was like Roy Cohn, that's what the photo is in there, there's one photo, I think it's Roy Cohn with Trump and McCarthy. And so I was looking at McCarthy kind of era, it was called Indifference Again, that there was kind of interested in this moment, there was an article by Nora Roth in Artforum in 71 or something like this. In a way, a lament against conceptual art, in a way, indifference projects. And but I thought her characterization was quite good. I just didn't agree with the ending. And her characterization was like with McCarthy, they're produced a kind of very hard split in culture between a kind of what she characterizes through Mike Hammer and J.D. Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, Golden Caulfield, like kind of that and passive, bitter passivity, and that there was a kind of hard split in culture between two extremes. I'd say everything became very extreme on both sides, and that within this extremist climate, there produced an art movement which tried to cool things down, which was about kind of conceptual art comes out of this. Jasper Johns, Rauschenberg, minimalism and pop. Buchloh expands that to like conceptual art and administrative art, or bureaucratic art in a way, and like instruction art, and that all this comes out of kind of this moment of kind of indifference of Duchamp also. And I thought I meant it as a kind of positive, for sure. And for me, it didn't come out, I'm not projecting it. Like, I wasn't trying to project, I mean, of course you do, if I suppose. But I meant it like really just trying to figure out what's the moment we're in. Again, as a kind of pedagogical thing, like what is this thing I'm in at the moment? Like, I just see a ton of different things, and there is no kind of clear, singular discourse, and there is, it's just kind of, there is a kind of removal even in the work to some degree. I just felt it. And so I thought of it as a way to try to frame what's going on in order to deal with it. And it's an aesthetic indifference, and it's a desire for non-ideology. Like everyone tries to reject a label that's put on them. Like I would you to go in conferences with other people and say, I think you're like this. No, I'm not like, I'm sometimes like that, but I'm like this too, and I'm some, what I mean? Like it's always both ands, or multiple things. It's the desire to avoid a singular position, to be able to move out of it. And for me, that's part of an indifference project, perhaps, this idea to avoid ideology.
I think the other thing that I find that they have in common is that, again, to use not my own term, they're both kind of cooled down positions, that they invite participation, they are meant to be kind of inclusive and engender new audiences. And I find them both to be sincere. I think one in a more direct way and the other in a kind of way that's not as evident. And I think maybe just to close out our portion, I think that sincerity as an ambition, I think, is what I would use to reject what I've learned you were also accused of, and Possible Mediums was accused of, which is the kind of ushering in of postmodernism again, which I think is, which I don't think is a kind of fair labeling projected on either of these projects. I think solely because there's a kind of level of sincerity that I find across all of your projects and all of the people's projects who are referred to in your piece.
It's a different set of things that we're discussing too. I mean, even some of the forms, let's say, are similar. They have different values. I mean, of course, people who live through that moment project all sorts of stuff on it, but it's like the whole conversation is radically different.
Yeah, maybe I'll just briefly also provide a little bit of context then. So, I mean, I think Michael maybe already referred to this, but like the past decade, I think architecture's been doing a lot of soul searching. You know, I think the 2008 economic crisis has something to do with that. I think the election of 2016 has also had a lot of impact on the way that people think, and I think one of the, let's say, fallouts of that has been a fear, or not a fear, but a kind of, I see a growing, say, rejection of aesthetics and design as being something that is important for architecture to work on. Because I think architecture is concerned with having discernible, measurable impact in the world. And I think what I wanted to offer with this, like with the idea of camp materiality, or what I wanted to kind of like try out for architecture, if we take Susan Sontag's idea of camp and try it on as an architectural disposition, is this idea that like there's actually agency in thinking about things on aesthetic terms, and that you know, she talks about camp as being something which actually like does work in the communities, right? I mean, she uses the word homosexuals because it's written in the 50s, but you know, in queer communities, that something like camp, or we could talk about drag, right, is actually it has agency. It actually does work. It isn't simply in this kind of aesthetic category. And so I think I was trying to just draw that connection for architecture. Because I'm a little scared, I guess, at times about the way in which conversations around design and aesthetics have been devalued, and I don't think I think it's a false choice. I think that you can.
Yeah. Good, thanks. We're happy to take a few questions. We have some time.
Hello, my name is Daryl. I'm our first year. My question is for you, Ellie. So, in regards to, and you think about pretty much superposition, how has, and I noticed that a few of, pretty much the majority of the images, they were plastered on pretty much flat surface material. So how has, or how could it be an effect on an image if a material that you choose to use is of a certain rigidity that it may actually bleed through an image and cause another type of pretty much opportunity of perception to happen?
An opportunity for another kind of what?
For another type of like
Is that perception, right?
yeah,
Perception. But are you talking about the kind of like actual physical qualities of the things we print on, or the things which receive image?
The actual surface of which it was placed onto, as a texture almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think like we're always thinking about thickness, right? So I think maybe one would begin with a conception of digital image as something which has no thickness. I think because we're interested in it as something which we can work with materially, it always has a thickness. I think sometimes that thickness is exaggerated or made explicit through the way in which we work with materiality. So, like, I think, you know, so sometimes image is the thing which becomes part of the material system for architecture. I think other times we try to produce image through material, right? So like on the top left, that's what I would say that is. So, And I think sometimes in projects like that, thickness actually is a perceptual one. It's the illusion of depth, let's say, that gets produced through kind of image making techniques. And other times we're actually physically like pulling things apart in space to try to produce more of a scene where you have three-dimensional and two-dimensional material working together.
Others? I have a question. Maybe this is for both of you, but especially in light of the piece you did in 2015, we said you were kind of searching for...
Body work, yeah. Body work.
Yeah, the body work, yeah. Do you think we've changed? Do you think we've moved since then? Are we still in the same place? I mean, in other words, are we still looking for some kind of vehicle to make sense of either movements or individual within, an individual office, how you actually see that production over time as coherent? I mean, do you think that we're still in a moment now that's, let's say, are we still in the same moment that we were in 2015? I ask because both of you this is ostensibly about medium, but there are other creative, let's say, arts that have dealt much more successfully with the Instagram world than has architecture, and that's in part because their means of production occurs much more quickly. I'm thinking of fashion, for example. If you look at what's happened, for example, with Gucci and with Alessandro Michele, I mean that's an embrace of this, let's say, nonsensical kind of everything goes world. But that happened for a particular reason around production, right? So there are no longer collections of seasons. You just buy individual things, you piece them together. That's a way of dealing with a world that seems to no longer have the kind of eddies and swirls and coherence that we did only 20 years ago. Is it a problem if we are still in the world of 2015 that you described? And if it's a problem, what do you do about it?
I do think that there's a need. I mean, Instagram is one way to deal with it, perhaps, but like what I was saying also is I thought Kyle was doing it too. Is that the need to produce new forms of collectivity, let's say, to allow us to produce venues where we can really. I don't know if Instagram is the place to do it. I mean, Instagram's kind of full of all sorts of stuff too, but where we can start to have it could be the beginning of something, to start to have a venue where we can compare and contrast things and talk about it, and it starts to have construct some values again, let's say. I think fashion deals with it. I mean, we deal with Instagram. Everyone deals with Instagram to some degree, although I don't know its effect yet. Maybe the image as material is a kind of result of image obsession, But I don't know if it really deals with Instagram as a kind of. That's more about its kind of physical qualities almost, or its medium qualities, than it is its social. Perhaps I don't know. You have to figure that out. But I don't really know. I still think we're probably in this. It's a different place, but maybe it's not that far off. I don't know.
Is it a problem?
No, it's an opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to think of all this stuff as okay, is good, positive. I'm definitely not one to lament. I didn't even think of indifference as everyone takes it as a kind of, like I'm somehow okay with the horrible politics that we're all going to be watching in a few minutes. I'm not at all. And it's something else. It's like, I think it's an opportunity. I think it was, out of that, John's, I definitely think Venturi as an architecture project is somehow tied to it. So it's like, perhaps that's why it gets lumped into Pomo, but I think it's more complicated nowadays. I do think there's a kind of culture which is like an appropriation culture. I don't think we care about structuralism or language even anymore. It's much more image. It's much more mood. Actually, anything, it's sensibility and tone and attitude. And for sure, body work can deal with that. Instagram can general. There isn't really anybody figuring out how to make it more specific yet. I just, you know.
We could just follow up. I mean, maybe that's the other question. Is that if it's an issue, if it's a problem, is it a problem for the architect or is it a problem for the critic? Because
Well, we don't have, that's
exactly. Yeah.
Can you do that? I mean, like, who's going to be the critic?
We
It's
don't have
embarrassing
critics
that we have to be our own, I feel like we have had to take on the roles of critics in a way and write to try to make sense of things, whereas I'd rather just be the one, like, doodling and making stuff.
So it is a problem with the critic, yeah.
I think that's a real problem, yeah. I mean, it's also the loss of a kind of public culture, the critics, the loss of the critic. Kind of a culture of architecture and discourse. Instagram isn't going to replace that because in the end it turns into emojis and, a couple rainbows and a clap.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I worry a little bit. I don't know. Maybe I'm more of a pessimist. Or I try to be optimistic, but maybe I'm more worried about let's just say like architecture kind of dissipating into design thinking, which like we don't know what that is. Nobody really knows what that is. You know. And maybe I'm reacting specifically to the culture in the institution where I teach. Where there's been like a tremendous amount of energy put towards things which I think are really important issues, like but also things like as I was saying, like measurable social impact and community engagement and participatory design and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these things are all like very, very important, and I think architecture needs to think about them, but I also think there are things being, lost in that conversation.
I mean, one thing that that's similar to both of us is that I think we start almost from, let's say, art historical narratives. And it's sort of a very classic way to start from art historical narratives or something like this, bring them into architecture, try to figure out what the heck is going on, try to make sense of it, do something else. I mean, that's for sure puts aesthetics as a kind of on the table, and aesthetics become political within the disciplinary narrative becomes political.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily escape that.
No, and to be clear, I'm not arguing for like kind of digging in our heels and remaining some kind of, in the ivory tower.
But you were saying the both, like you could do both, is what I thought.
You can do both.
I thought you're positive.
Well, I know, but it doesn't seem like that's the kind of dominant narrative that's happening. And let me just say, and the other thing that worries me.
We're working on social housing, and we're still talking about this stuff. So we're dealing with, we're trying to fix the world.
That's fair. I think the other thing I think is, like architecture's relationship to digital technology, not in terms of image production and design, but actually the rest of it, data and algorithms, and so if you think about WeWork or a company like that, where like they don't actually need architects, right? They use dark data to optimize design.
They just need the architect.
And right, but as a figurehead, they need the architect as a figurehead, and they need somebody to curate a set of wallpapers. But like, so that's the future, whether we like it or not. And I think we need to figure out what our role in that future is. So that's getting away from indifference, but just generally like taking the temperature. I think there's some things to work on.
Are there any other questions? Okay, let's conclude by thanking Ellie and Michael for their contribution.